Democracy without economic freedom means little to the masses. It can best be promoted through a rights-based approach. This is the core philosophy of consumer unity and trust society. Cuts began in 1983 with a unique wall newspaper, Gram Gaddar, which means Village Revolution. It was an attempt to fill the information gap with a focus on the rural poor of Rajasthan. The plight of the poor in accessing basic necessities like food, medicines and power was the driving force behind the establishment of Cuts. Work was started out of a motor garage with a zero budget. In those days of socialism, the quality of most goods and services was poor and was accompanied by shortages. For instance, the number of matchsticks per box was much less than the declared quantity of 50. Matchsticks being a mass commodity like salt, consumers would feel the impact of being fleeced of several million rupees annually. This scenario improved after Cuts took legal action. Using a law to assert consumer rights is often more effective than advocacy. Cuts' public interest litigation on female sterilization victims is an example. It led to a change in the government's policy of targeting women as numbers. Helping persuade the government to pass the Consumer Protection Act in India was one of Cuts' most successful efforts of the early 80s. This led to the realization that promoting economic democracy is a vital part of political democracy. It also brought about the realization that business has to behave with consumers and that the state has to ensure a balance between the consumers and the producers' interests. In 1990, Cuts campaigned for the poor and, with the blessings of Mother Teresa, marked 1st November as World Poverty Day. Soon after, the UN adopted October 17th as the International Day for the Eradication of Poverty. It was around the same time that developing countries like India adopted liberalization and deregulation. Unlike many NGOs, Cuts supported the reforms, but understood that effective regulatory regimes were needed. It then adopted a second motto: liberalization, yes, but with safety nets. The first being value for people. Jagdish Bhagwati, noted trade economist. Cuts has developed from a modest NGO addressing mainly domestic issues to a preeminent position as an international NGO dealing with issues relating to the world trading system and related issues. In July 1991, Cuts participated in the 13th World Consumer Congress in Hong Kong. It was the first international exposure for Cuts. There were heated discussions on a new multilateral trade agreement, which 4 years later led to the creation of WTO. From trade policy, Cuts expanded into investment, corporate governance, and competition policy. It received huge support from the Frederick Ebert Foundation to launch work on trade policy and globalization in South Asia in 1994. This is how the South Asia Watch on Trade, Economics and Environment came into being in the next year.
The business model of Salty was widely recognized as a good example of regional network-based approach to empowering civil society organizations on the issues of globalization. This led to Cuts establishing its centers in Lusaka, Zambia in 2000 and Nairobi, Kenya in the year 2003 respectively.
The Hanoi Center came into being in 2007, followed by one in Geneva in 2008.
establishment of Kutch International Geneva in 2008 was a turning point in Kutch history. A donor, Hewlett Foundation, approached Kutch with a grant for this purpose instead of the classical way of Kutch approaching a donor.
Furthering the cause of the right to trade, particularly of poor countries, Kutch is advocating for a Geneva consensus on the international level for fair trade, good governance and capacity building. Surendra Kanstia, former chairman, Consumer Guidance Society of India, Mumbai. Kutch gave me the wisdom, whereas other organizations gave me knowledge and training. As its work on trade policy increased, Kutch Secretary General Pradeep Mehta was twice appointed as advisor by two WTO Director Generals, Supachai Panichpakdi in 2003 and Pascal Lamy in 2012. To ensure that the fruits of liberalization reached everyone, Kutch worked for competition law and regulatory policies in India and 30 other countries in Asia and Africa. The multi-country 7-Up model was the most popular in this regard. A critical point of difference with similar projects was Kutch's approach, which was bottom-up. Gareth Thomas, former Minister of State, DFID, UK. We value the productive relationship that Kutch and Department for International Development, DFID, had built up in recent years on this agenda. An emphasis on creating local ownership and capacities was followed by comparisons with other countries. Post this, many southern governments appointed Kutch as their advisors. Kutch was also responsible for the adoption and refinement of competition law in many countries, particularly India. Besides trade and regulation, Kutch's spectrum of work includes governance. Its 20th anniversary celebrations followed the theme Governance and its relationship with poverty reduction. The following actions led to several new initiatives, such as building capacities of smaller NGOs, using the Right to Information Act, making citizen report cards, community scorecards, and public expenditure tracking surveys. With the support of the World Bank, Kutch was appointed as the regional anchor for South Asia's Community of Practice on Social Accountability in 2012.
We celebrated our 25th anniversary in the year 2008 with a conference on Global Partnership for Development. The focus was on the Millennium Development Goal 8, which talks about Global Partnership for Development. The Millennium Development Goals are an international challenge taken up by the international community to halve poverty by the year 2015. And in that, an enabling environment is to create a better economic environment to be able to add to the growth which is necessary to create the wherewithal to reduce poverty. While we have been working internationally as well as nationally on a very large number of issues, one of the understanding that we had, and this is something which we've been doing for a long time, is to intensify our work at the grassroots. In southern Rajasthan, for example, we have taken up promotion of livelihoods for poor women, and they are organized in about 1,000 self-help groups covering over 100,000 women. In the future, how we visualize, having completed 30 years now, we realize that we will continue to consolidate our work as well as make it more effective, and I would say cost effective as well. And that is how I visualize the journey for Kutch for the next 20 years.
Our values: adhering to high standards of accountability and transparency, adoption of a centrist approach, ensuring outcomes rather than just outputs, Focus on subject and geographical areas where a vacuum and need exist. Enhancing capacity of various stakeholders across Asia and Africa through an inclusive approach.